This would be a good time for me to invite in our remaining three panelists. Joining us first is Ed Vessel. He's a research scientist at the NYU Center for Brain Imaging and an internationally recognized expert on neuroaesthetics. His research combines brain imaging, that's, for example, MRI imaging, with behavioral and computational approaches to studying how individuals are moved by or get pleasure from visual experiences. Please welcome Ed Vessel. Our next participant, David Freedberg, is the Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art at Columbia University and Director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America. He's known, among other things, for his work related to psychological responses to art, and is now devoting a substantial portion of his attention to collaborations with neuroscientists. I was delighted to see, as a cognitive neuroscientist, that in fact Professor Freedberg has published articles together with neuroscientists working in the fields of vision, movement, and emotion. Movement and emotion being very much a part of the aesthetic response to art. Please welcome David Freedberg. David. And finally, we have scholars of art, we have researchers of the brain, we have curators, but what about the artist? Matthew Ritchie, our next participant, is a painter, sculptor, and digital artist. His work combines science, architecture, history, and the dynamics of culture, which is an issue that has already been brought up, the role of culture, to explore the idea of information. He is featured in the collections of numerous institutions, including MoMA and the Guggenheim Museum. In 2001, Time magazine listed him as one of its 100 innovators for the new millennium. Please welcome Matthew Ritchie. Matthew, thank you. So let's tee it off with some big issues. Why talk about the mind or the brain when we talk about art? What can we learn about art from studying the brain? And maybe the converse. Can we learn anything about the brain from studying art? Why don't we start with David?
So I'm convinced that we can. I want to begin with a recollection, and that is when I was a young teacher at the Courtauld Institute in London, and Luke was just beginning his career as a young student at the Courtauld Institute in London. Those were the days when people said, those were the days, but they were not the good old days, because those were the days when people said emotional responses should not count as aesthetic responses. We should look at how the eye travels from A to B. We should look at composition and color and so on and so forth. These are all very valid questions to ask about art. But I couldn't help thinking that whenever we look at a great work of art, we are moved. Whenever we see a frightening image, we seem to flee. So I wrote a very long book about psychological responses to art and also about bodily responses, the way in which we move, the way in which we react to works of art. This was in the middle of the 1980s, and it was just at this time that the discipline known as cognitive neuroscience started taking its first steps, and I swiftly became aware that we finally had a way of talking about our emotional and our embodied responses to works of art in a more rational, in a more decisive way than the usual sentimental ways in which we spoke about works of art. And from that moment on, I knew that I had to begin studying not only the history of art, but the ways in which the brain, the neural substrate of the brain, underlay our behavioral responses to works of art.
Ed, would you like to add anything to that general question about the role of studying the brain and studying art, the relationship between the two?
Sure. I think that the study of aesthetics and artwork, which is ancient, has always been very interested in how it is that our internal space, our internal thoughts are affected by the world around us, and even art as a communication tool taps into this question of what's going on inside our heads when we look at something, or when we're moved by something, or when we look at a drawing that someone has made. What are they trying to tell us? So I think, just as David said, the advent of tools that actually allow us to study the neural responses is a natural extension of the artistic endeavor in general. Artists themselves, I think, are often trying to understand something about perception or something about emotion or people's responses when they're creating art and when they're communicating. And I think we should welcome these new tools that allow us to understand at a deeper level how our aesthetic responses to the world relate to the other systems that we're learning about in the brain.
Right. So you were kind enough to allow the World Science Festival to come into your laboratory. So let's go into your laboratory.
The first thing that we're going to do is we are interested in understanding personal aesthetic experience. And when they're seeing the artwork in the scanner, they're seeing it for the first time. We're actually capturing the brain's response to this novel piece of artwork and their initial reaction to it, rather than a memory of what they felt about it previously or what they think another person might believe about that artwork. In order to show people images, we use a mirror that is mounted above their head inside the magnet. That mirror allows them to see a projection screen that is at the back of the MRI machine. Then we can control by a computer in the control room. So we can run experimental software where we show people images for very tightly controlled periods of time, and we can collect their behavioral responses, and we can do all of that while they are in the scanner looking at images and responding using a small button box that they can control. Both in basic behavioral psychological experiments and particularly in MRI, the task design is incredibly important. Okay, Alex, hit the index key whenever you see a repeat of the exact same image, okay? Okay, good. Here we go. A large portion of the medial prefrontal cortex seems to be very strongly engaged when people are looking at artwork that they found moving. There's definitely a lot left to learn in terms of exactly what this means.
Ed, can you tell us something about the findings and maybe show us some of, you have brain images?
Sure.
Yes.
I'm really excited to get the chance to actually walk you through some data. The work I'm going to be telling you about is a collaboration between myself and Gavi Starr and Nava Rubin. So I think that the first thing, and they put in a segment about this in the video, that I want to get across is that in this particular study, what we're really focusing on are people's individual responses. So this study is not attempting to understand what is it that makes a particular piece of art a great work of art, or what is it that makes one piece of art a good work of art and another piece of art a bad work of art. We're really interested in understanding what happens in an observer's brain when they are moved by a particular piece of artwork. And so one thing we find is that the particular pieces of art that people are moved by is quite different, and they might be moved for very different reasons. So some people might like things that are kind of conventionally pretty, other people might be moved by things which are sad, other people might be moved by things which we might describe as sublime. So what we do is we show people this artwork, and they are giving us a 4-point response, with a 4 being those images that they found most moving, and a 1 being those images that they found least moving. So when we contrast these responses, this kind of 4 versus 1 contrast, we're able to identify a number of regions in the brain that show sensitivity to aesthetic appreciation. And many of these regions have been described and by other groups as well. So we're starting to see some concordance in the findings across many different labs. Now, when we look closer at the responses in these regions, there are, I think, two things that are really important that we found. And I think we might have some images to put up for that. Yeah. So in this first image here, you're looking at, on the left, representations of the brain. So on the top, this would be as if you're looking at the side of a person's head. The eye would be just to the left and under that gray inflated cortex. And what is highlighted in pink are a few regions that are in the back portion of the brain, in regions that we think underlie sensation and perception and the extraction of meaning. And what you see on the right is that all of these regions show a response that is different for the different levels of preference that people indicated for the images. So for example, on the top plot, you see that if I show you an image you rate as a 1, you get a little bit of a response above baseline. And if I show you an image you rate a 2, it's a little bit higher, and then a little bit higher, and finally the highest for those images you found intensely moving. So the thing that struck me is that in all of these regions in the back of the brain, we see this linear response. Now in the next image, you see two other regions of the brain which are subcortical regions. So they are not part of the surface part of the brain, which is the kind of newest part of the mammalian brain. These are in deeper structures. And in these structures, you also see this linear pattern, but now you see that rather than always being positive or always being negative, it actually straddles this zero line. And so again, these regions are showing a linear response, but in this case, they're kind of indicating both positive and negative. In contrast, in the next image, we've highlighted a few regions in the front part of the brain. So there are a few of them circled here. And in these regions, you see a very different pattern. So rather than seeing this linear pattern, we see that if you rated an artwork a 1, a 2, or even a 3, these regions don't seem to differentially respond. These regions only become more active for those images that you rated as being truly moving, very strongly moving. So we think that we're able to see that the brain regions that mediate your aesthetic appreciation are composed of two separate systems. One system that is involved perhaps in the more sensory and semantic analysis of an artwork, and a separate system that we think is likely involved in more of the emotional response. So an aesthetic experience involves both of these components. Mm-hmm. Now, importantly, out of these second set of regions, we saw a few regions light up that really caught our attention, and I think we highlight this on the last image. So here you can see this contrast is actually, we're showing what happens when you look just at the 4 response versus all the others. And you can see that this huge chunk of tissue is more active. And importantly, on the upper right, you see that one of these regions, it shows this step-like pattern, just like I highlighted before. But in this case, it's always below baseline. What does this mean? These regions are part of a brain network that has been identified by other labs as the part of the default mode network. And the idea that other labs are coming to is that this set of brain regions actually supports self-referential thought. And it supports when you, for example, make a decision about what you want to do tomorrow, or if you decide if an emotional term applies to you, or if you think about your own personal space versus someone else's doing a similar action. And so that fits with what we're seeing in that when I show you most artworks, these regions are suppressed. However, when I show you an artwork that you find moving, these regions actually come back up to a level of activation that normally seems reserved for self-referential thought. So while we have a lot more work to do to exactly understand what this means, we think that this is, we're seeing a neural signature of an external object really kind of triggering this personally relevant response, kind of this internal part of your mind. And so I think that's, to me, it's really highlighted this interesting link that through this neuroimaging, we can start to get a sense that for confirmation for what many people have thought about the nature of aesthetics and start to understand how that maps onto particular neural systems.
Thank you, Ed. David, in my mind, you represent the future of this future model, sort of the third way of intellectual inquiry that's not siloed within a traditional discipline. As an art historian yourself, you have now crossed over, if you like, and you're studying neurons in the brain. Now, it wasn't that long ago before that would have been, when that would have been unthinkable, and probably your colleagues would have said, what are you doing? I doubt you would have done that when you were trying to get tenure at Columbia. Okay. But today, that is emerging as the future, is this cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary or whatever you want to call it, disciplinary work that brings together the sciences and the arts. And that is very close to my own heart or brain or mind. Now, your research on the brain focuses on another function of the brain, which is the motor response, movement. And I know from studying music that it turns out that when you listen to music, even if you're lying quietly in an MRI machine, your motor cortex becomes very active. It's as if the brain cannot resist wanting to move to the music. So music is not just about emotion, it's also about movement. And apparently, you believe that visual art is as well. Take us through some of your work and your thinking with some of the examples. I know that you've used in your work the Michelangelo's The Expulsion from Paradise and the ceiling of Sistine Chapel, but take us through your work as you see fit.
Thank you, Jamshed. I don't think I would get tenure even now. Art historians are very resistant to science. So, in fact, I said, except for some notable exceptions here, whom we have with us, there are very few visionaries like Jamshed out. I invite him to join my department. I wish now that he is having battles to face at Cooper, perhaps we can offer him an adjunct position at Columbia.
He offered me a use of his office at Columbia.
So now, despite the fact that I had my images in a different order, let's begin right with the famous expulsion from Paradise, which you will all remember is on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And I had long begun I'd long worked on the subject of how it is that when we see a gesture in a work of art, a gesture like this, or even a gesture like this in grief, or even a gesture of sadness or joy with your hands upraised, you have a sense in yourself of emulating that action. You feel your body is reacting to the image itself. You may not actually copy, but you have a sense of your bodily self. So I actually began my work by collaborating with a group of distinguished neuroscientists in Parma who had been working on something called mirror neurons. Now, mirror neurons, since they were discovered in the early 1990s, have become widely known. And most of you will know that these experiments were done initially with monkeys because you can measure single neurons in monkeys. You cannot do this, of course, in human beings. You can't just stick an electrode in a normal person's brain. We will come back to this in a moment. And perhaps we'll have a look at the other images with which, the other wonderful paintings with which I began my researches. But what we found was that when an observing monkey observes another monkey engaged in a goal-directed action, the same parts of the viewer's premotor cortex fires as it does in the case of the monkey performing that action. We later found that this could also be found in the case of human beings. How did we find this? Find this out because, of course, in the case of pre-epileptic surgery examinations, you can actually have the patient conscious and look at the responses to individual neurons. So there used to be people who said, you've never found, monkeys are irrelevant to human beings, but they are not always, as we know. So now let's go to one of the great works of art in the history of Western art. And I was very interested in not only in the copying of actions, but the sense of movement, for example, that we have when we see a dance performance. So I went to my neuroscientist colleague and I said, let's see what people feel when you see a dance performance. And he said, let's see what kinds of simulation, inward simulation you have of dance movements. He said, don't be ridiculous. We cannot measure so many muscles at once. Take a simple gesture. Take a simple wrist gesture like this. find a work of art. I thought immediately of the expulsion from Paradise. And so this is what we did. He was an expert not in fMRI, but in something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what we did very simply was we made viewers look at Michelangelo's expulsion from Eden. But what we did prior to that was, this is how the TMS experiment works. You apply a coil to the part of the scalp which is over the premotor cortex, which is responsible for the activation of your wrist. And I did this experiment myself, and it goes bzzz, like this, and you feel your wrist sort of twist slightly upwards. And what we established was the lowest amount of magnetic current necessary to cause that action. Then what we did very simply, to cut a rather long story short, we showed them this action on the Sistine ceiling, a big picture, not cooped up in that little scanner or in the scanner there, you know, it's going bang, bang. You didn't hear the sounds that the scanner makes, that Ed uses. We showed them the Sistine ceiling, and what we found very simply was that when viewers looked at this picture of Michelangelo's Adam raising his hand to ward off the angel, a lower amount of current was necessary to stimulate that action. So the mere sight of an image caused a motor response. And let me just have a look at our next, could we have the graph, please, very briefly? Should move on to the next one. There we go. So I had a colleague of mine emulate that action. And needless to say, as you can see, the amount of current necessary to stimulate an action was greater, meant that the motor evoked potential is lower in the case of him trying to emulate that movement than in the case of Michelangelo himself. In other words, Michelangelo was extremely good at evoking a simulatory motor response on the part of the viewer. And we next did another experiment. We showed a photograph of the picture in black and white, and we found, you won't be surprised to hear, that photographs were not as good as Michelangelo at raising the motor evoked potential. So then, actually, the way this all began was I was very interested in a statement by William James in 1890 in his Principles of Psychology, in which he said, the movement precedes the emotion. I wanted to think, what is the relationship between movement and emotion? Because you would usually think you see the snake in the forest, you have a fright and you run away. James said, no, you see the snake, you see something in the forest, you run away, and only then do you realize it's a snake, and only then do you have the feeling of fear. Can we have a look at the next picture, please? I hope it's going to be the Roger van der Weyden. Can we have the Roger van der Weyden, please? Great. So this is one of the great works of Western art. As you know, it's late 1430s. It's in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And when you go there, it's in a room of great paintings. Everybody clusters around this great picture. I could spend the next 10 minutes, but I think I probably only have 4 left, just describing how wonderfully composed this work is. And there's no question that people admire it for the beauty of its colors, the extraordinary delineation of the bodies and of the muscles, the wonderful modeling of the faces. But what's interested me as an art historian was the fact that this picture was predicated on the viewer's involvement with the emotions of the people suffering around Christ. Next image, please. Can we have a look at their faces, for example? When you see these sorrowing faces, when you see the face of John the Evangelist and Nicodemus on the right around Christ, you have an immediate sense of the emotion. And we now know that when you see an emotional expression on a face, the same parts of your brain are activated as they would be if you were feeling that experience yourself. And so Roger van der Weyden was good at evoking the exact kind of emotion he required. Can we go on to the next image, please? And look at this. Here is one of the Marys clasping her hands to her face to dry her eyes. And, well, I wanted to show you another one of the Magdalene crossing her arms across her body. When we see these gestures, we have a sense ourselves of the actions that accompany the emotions. And all this, it seemed to me, was explicable also in terms of the same principle that when we see an action, we feel it in ourselves and it produces the relevant emotion. I'll give you one very dramatic example. Oh, no, 2. Next, still back to the main Roger, the main picture. a great art historian, once pointed out that the Virgin, who is usually represented standing, this is where neuroscience can actually supplement the history of art. The Virgin, usually represented standing and mourning beside the dead body of Christ, or the declining body of Christ, slumps in exactly the same way. She has an emulatory slump of Christ's own body. And this is what we would feel too. We slump in empathetic involvement with that declining body of Christ. And the theory that I have been trying to put forward to my irritated colleagues is that you don't need, they always say to know, how would somebody from, I say, here comes the Papua New Guinea question. How would the Papua New Guinean response to this? She knows nothing about the history of the Passion of Christ. She doesn't know anything about the Old or New Testament. Well, I would say that in order to understand this, the basic elements of sorrow that is so essential to an image such as this, you don't need to know the text. This is why we call great works of art transcendent from time to time. Of course it's true that your understanding of such a picture will be helped by your knowledge of the Bible and other texts, but people from other cultures can understand this work of art through their bodies and through the ways in which it emotionally resonates. Probably said enough at this point. So we could go on forever. What I wanted to say was how you actually understand the strokes of a painter in a similar way. We could have talked about the effect, for example, of those strokes in those Rubens's bold brushstrokes in the Samson and Delilah, with which Luke concluded this afternoon. This too arouses a motor response in the viewer that translates into an emotional response. It gets you worked up, it gets you roused, and that's essential to the effects of pictures. Thank you.
Speaking of Luke, would you like to add anything about any of these works, The Expulsion from Paradise, or cultural significance?
I suppose I'm struck still, and I mean, I come into this rather, for David, boring category of skeptical art historian, but that's really what I'm here to do, is to think about these issues of an initial emotional response as opposed to certain kinds of learnt emotional response. In other words, I still wonder whether the person from Papua New Guinea might be more distracted by seeing alien costumes and ethnically different people and so on and so forth before they focus on the sorrow, the essential sorrow of the expressions depicted. They might even be distracted, I would suggest, by the fact that what they're seeing, and this again is something I wanted to ask all of you really, the difference between experiencing somebody's sorrow in real life, because I think if I were to walk into the middle of this village in Papua New Guinea and weep, then I think on the whole I hope that the people would overcome their slight alarm at this sight and comfort me. Whereas I think seeing it depicted with a whole set of pictorial conventions might get in the way of the kind of emotional response that you're talking about. So in other words, I suppose what I'm saying is that I'm prepared to believe that there are certain kind of fundamental responses once you're open to them, if you like, and I wonder from Ed whether, you know, when he's putting people into that machinery, whether again these are people who are what we might describe as visually literate in some ways, or at least that the works of art that you're showing them come into a category with which they're broadly familiar. I mean, you know, that image making in itself is part of the culture that they belong to. That's where my questions arise, you know, and come from really the kinds of questions I was asking in the Plain or Fancy show. Is that are there some fundamental values to these works of art, especially when you move beyond the figurative and into what we might describe as the abstract? The studies that I've read in this territory tend to talk about abstraction as a 20th century phenomenon and analyze it from that point of view. As a decorative arts historian, I would argue that abstraction goes some way further back, and if you choose to look at objects of the kind that I've just shown you, and therefore, you know, that may be where one would start to find some universals. And obviously, speaking as, you know, as a curator in a museum that sets out, in a sense, to analyze what appears to be a universal impulse to make works of art, then you know, it becomes of a sort of profound interest to me.
So this is a very...
two slightly different questions.
I'm going to try and answer this longish question briefly.
Let's do it briefly, and we can come back at the
in.
end, because these are very
Sure.
deep questions. Just a brief response from each of you, if you'd like. Yes.
So actually, Ed and I began a discussion this on WNYC just yesterday, and I want to see if I can bring him in a minute. But the basic point that seems to escape Luke and my colleagues is that is no one is claiming that people have different responses to pictures. What I am interested in is the initial response upon which the cultures may exercise the influence. We cannot understand our responses even from individual cultures until we understand those kinds of basic responses which are modified by other inputs. And this is where actually Ed is a real expert. So, but before I give the opportunity for him to explain what happens, as it were, next, and he began to explain by saying what happens after you get struck by something, after you become involved. You then withdraw yourself from it, and he has the secret in a way with his default state network, the DSN, which he was talking about. But I wanted to say make one small correction of Luke, because even with abstract patterns in the past, not only abstract patterns now, we have a sense of the residue left by the hand of the artist. We have a sense of the way the artist's hand might move. And so I'm convinced that both with a Tureen as well as with, shall we say, Jackson Pollock, motor cortex is also aroused. I should say also, when you see that green goblet from Holland, we now know that there's another class of neurons called canonical neurons which fire in the motor cortex because your hand prepares to grasp something which you know will serve as a means to drink. So these are basic level responses which are then modulated by culture. And we know exactly what happens in the brain when this happens. I'm going to pass this over to Ed.
Sure. So I think the way that I think about this issue, the way I tend to frame it, is that I view the aesthetic response that people have to an artwork or to a scene or to any kind of sensory experience, just going beyond even a visual experience, as riding on top of a system that is built to allow humans to be infovores. That is, that drives us to seek out new information. And the idea there is that we might have, as an example, let's say you walk into a cafe and you see a friend of yours, and you see a different friend of yours, but you don't know that they know each other, and you see them talking to each other. The fact that you see them talking to each other is interesting, and you get pleasure from looking at it, and you're going to pay attention to it, and you're going to code it, right? Or maybe you won't get pleasure, but it will definitely, that fact will carry a lot of weight, and that's actually the better way to express it, which is that some information is more important than other information for determining an aesthetic response or any kind of emotional response. So when I think about how someone from another culture might approach a work of art, clearly the tools that you have to analyze the world are going to be a limiting factor on your response. So a young child who has yet to develop certain visual skills or who has yet to learn certain facts about the world might find different things pleasurable to look at, or might be moved by different things than someone who has become an expert in a particular class of art, or someone who does not have experience with the two-dimensional use of space that Western cultures or certain cultures have may not get as much from it. And so clearly our ability to get pleasure and motivation perhaps for learning from any type of medium, whether or not it be a conversation or a visual work of art or a piece of music, is dependent upon the neural tools that we have to analyze the world. And my thought is that, just to bring it back to the default mode network, is that if you think about information hierarchically, that is, that there's information very close to the receptor surface. There's activation of ganglion cells in the eye, or there's touch receptors on the finger. As you move from that low-level sensory representation through the systems of the brain that are built to extract higher and higher levels of semantic association, these higher levels of semantic association are more important for determining a response. And perhaps one way to think about this is that sitting at the top of that hierarchy is this network that is really assessing personal relevance and captures something about your sense of who you are and how you relate to the world. So self-information is in fact kind of the most potentially interesting, or information that is really relevant to how you view the world. And just one last thing, which is that I'm really struck how David's work on kind of motor empathy really fits with some evolving ideas of mind that may be one of the things that the default mode network might be doing when you see it co-active with these sensory networks, which it typically is not. Typically they are anti-correlated, is that perhaps you are seeing a form of imagery, a form of interplay where you have the sense of self projecting back down and interplaying with the sensory systems. And that's pure speculation at this point. We really don't know how the interaction of these systems might relate to imagery.
Thank you. Matthew, you've been very patient. We have heard from art historians and neuroscientists and some combinations of the two. But you actually make art. And so you've heard people talking about art, about the brain, but you actually do it. What role do you think the artist's hand plays in the way a work is received and perceived? And are there works in which the artist's hand may not be revealed?
Well, I'd like to just respond to
Please
very
respond
briefly,
to anything that they've
as
said.
briefly as the panelists have been so far. So I should have about half an hour. So it felt a bit like the story of the elephant with the three blind men, each holding the tail and the foot and the trunk, saying, and I'm sort of the elephant in the room, being tugged. You're all right. You're all absolutely correct. And each one of those describes one of the systems that an artist is looking at while they're, and all of those systems come together. And I also feel a bit like everyone sort of gets an apology, because the feeling you described about this kind of alienation of art historians from the material is typical of 20th century art. It's been a process of alienation, and it's no wonder there's a kind of intense debate. But the kind of good news is that I feel also, looking at the graphs and the MRI scans, that we're emerging, that there's a new kind of vocabulary that's beginning to emerge that we have to deal with as well. And this is going to be, we're not really at the end of that period of alienation, doomed to a sort of endless series of monolithic, inexplicable artworks, although I'm going to show you one of those. We're at the beginning of something really new, which is the representation of information in art as a conscious act of artists rather than as an unconscious act. And in a way, it's kind of coming full circle, because you walk around the Met and you see culture after culture with these incredibly sophisticated languages, like Greek descriptions of aesthetics. They have hundreds of terms to describe every mood, every color, every feeling, every time of day, how the story should feel. And we have this. We're just getting going. So it's no wonder it feels a little bit like, well, you see that part and I see this part. And how do they all fit together again? Because we're building a new culture. It's only really 200 years old. And so some of the work that we've done along the way, I think if we could have the slide of the Warhol. So this is a work where you sort of see the kind of perfect example of like total alienation of society as machine. It's a picture of the artist who looks sort of dead. He's wearing a wig. You really can't get much of an aesthetic sort of, it's not the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, that's for sure. It's this.
He looks pretty expelled to me.
This is the kind of, and he's the archetypal 20th century artist, to be admired for taking us to a kind of limit case of what happens when you evacuate all of the signifiers except the presence of the self. But the thing that Warhol was really chronologically not timed for, it had happened before in the work of Duchamp, too early, and now will happen at the end of the century again, is the question of abstraction, which is really a question of like dealing with universals. And it's why I think when Luke talks about universal notions of symmetry and pattern, those are things that were not solely to do with the presence of the gesture or the utility of a person, but were also to do with our recognition of what constitutes, in the very broadest terms, nature. Because nature manifests itself in all kinds of highly abstract phenomena that if you walk around the Met, you'll see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures with little hands pointing. And the hand is always set into a context that's got a color and an indicating background, and then a framing device. Sometimes it's nature, sometimes it's a highly geometric order. And each of those gives you the codes to unpack what the hand is pointing at, or supposed to be holding, or gesturing towards. And sometimes they're contained within objects, sometimes they're outside objects. So I have a work, I think it should be next in the little slide sequence I'm going to talk about a little bit. So my work is about trying to do all of that at once, which is absurd, of course. It's totally futile. You can turn the volume down just a little bit. This is a sculpture in Istanbul, and we presented it here. It was the second piece of public art ever seen in the city. And there's none of the cultural background that you might expect. It's composed of hundreds and hundreds of fractal units that are based on a model of the universal structure proposed by a physicist called Paul Steinhardt. So it's an actual scientific model, but it's also made up of hundreds of drawings of mine as I went through that in a series of chaotic loops. And then inside it plays music. And the music plays sort of all day, and we've shown it in various places. The most beautiful thing that happened in Sevilla was the local songbirds learned the music in the sculpture and began to sing it back. And I suspect they're singing it still, the sculpture's long gone. Then in Istanbul, the human beings were there were sort of just pigeons and human beings, and presumably lots of it was an urban context, probably small creatures wandering around at night. It was near a market. So when it played this sort of beautiful music, some of the people would actually sort of say it was a gift from God. They were very touched by it. They saw it directly as a manifestation of a sort of human will. They didn't see it as with any intermediate art requirements. And then when it played music they didn't like, they would throw stones at it. Because they saw it as an imposition of a human will coming from the other side. And I thought this is a kind of, this notion that an abstract, something where I was interested in Luke talking about the things in the MRI machines. Like, most of those images are sort of things from a vocabulary that can be reassembled, a process that I would call eidetic variation. Yeah. When you look at something, you sort of riff through your memory to see what it's like, and you find the closest thing. And that makes you, and the closer it is to something you recognize, the neural threshold is lower, as David was talking about, for a response. Then you have to do a little more work, and it goes into the default mode network that you're sort of talking about. And then you have to do a little more work, and it starts to attach to all of these other concepts. So the question I would sort of have is, between us, are we sort of at the threshold? Do we think this is something? Is this an emergent state? And if so, how can I use it? What feed the elephant?
Let's come back to that. But first, would you be able, again, as a practitioner, as the elephant, as you said, tell us more about what it's like to be the elephant, and rather than being the three blind men? And I think you have a demonstration to take us through your creative process.
I do.
Yes, please.
I'll only take a moment. And this is elephants do actually like to paint, for those of you who've seen those wonderful films of elephants with. So I thought this would be a good comparison. This is an artist trying to do sort of something like science, which is a bit like an elephant trying to paint. So something I do in my practice, as you saw in that sculpture, is I create networks of ideas. So this is a network I made of this panel. Over here, here's Luke. Over here, there's Luke. There's Ed. There's David. And these are all the ideas we've been talking about.
Can you just delete one of those names?
And so this is this idea of observation. And you can see everything sort of is linked to everything else, this idea of self-reflection. And if you go down the bottom, if you like to think of this little arrow following through this kind of neural thing, this is like the hand of God in sort of Michelangelo, moving around. This is the easy way. There's an image or a gesture we know. The mirror neurons kick in, the short-term memory, then you have recognition, reactions to figurative art. And I believe there's some studies, I'm not sure if Ed's been involved in them, that show that people generally respond positively to figurative art. Now, unfortunately for myself as an abstract artist, you follow the same observation down here, you compare it, now it starts to move into all these other things. These all create more work for your brain. And so the reactions to abstract art are highly variable over here because people have to work harder. Now but they're also being asked a much harder question, which is the relationships between images and ideas. And that question connects you to this network. which is, so somewhere down here is the relationships between images and ideas. Here's, Luke, here's David. And all of this up here, this is sort of, remember, this is just an artist thinking, so please, I hope to be judged absolutely harshly by this incredibly eminent panel. So all of these ideas are interlinked together. So it's no wonder, in a way, that we have lower thresholds for responding to things that we don't necessarily know, because these are, in a sense, the terms under which we understand nature, and they extend all the way up through sort of a theory of mind, theory of body, to the concepts of universal cosmologies and quantum field theory. All of the things that your body is actually processing all of the time in the deep background. That stuff is being processed. So it's a very rich field. And my feeling is that this information, in cultures that have a significant history, they begin to figure out codes, compositional codes for embedding that in the backgrounds, what we think of as the background of the work, but are really the kind of central way of understanding the work. And so they end up giving us that hand as the last gesture, not the first gesture. We read it first, but it's really the product of a meaning system. And that's what our culture is busy developing right now, is how do we create that out of abstract data? Something like this begins to turn into, I think we have a slide of the sculpture again. And you begin to see, or that network right there, you begin to see this as a kind of, we're beginning to see works that are these networks. And then we ourselves become engaged in them on a bodily way, quite differently than needing a hand to show us which button to press.
Thank you, Matthew. Now, before we go on to more of a free-for-all, I'm going to ask some deeper philosophical and provocative questions and hope we can get some discussion. I just want to ask if any of you has something else burning that you want to be sure to get out, or if you have any other media that you'd like to show. Okay, yes, did you?
Yeah. I can definitely say something
Please.
related to this, but I'm happy
Please,
to
go
wait.
ahead, go ahead, yeah.
Just one thing that this struck me, just as kind of a background thought, perhaps to kind of put aside and think about how it relates to this, is that a few years ago, Nava Rubin and I did a study where we showed people abstract images like fractals and kaleidoscopic images, and also showed these same subjects real-world photographs. So set aside art for a moment, and we were coming at this from more of a background that we know that people don't always agree on which photographs they like, but there's quite high agreement. And so I would say one correction to, at least from my perspective, the fact that representational art or photograph is always preferred. More what I find is that is more, there's higher agreement in that you and I might like the same photographs and we might also dislike the same photographs. So that's what we find, that people show relatively high concordance in which photographs they like, but the same people show much, much lower agreement in which abstract images they like, which is kind of what you said, that there's much higher variability when you look at abstract art. Now, the thing that's missing in this is kind of the emotional responses that people have to images. And so, in fact, when we look at artwork, we find that even with representational artwork, you find that people show highly individual differences. So the semantic associations that may be driving common responses to real-world scenes might still be there in representational art, but then the emotional responses that people have kind of overwhelm that and push people back in this direction of having highly individual responses.
Thank you. So, Luke, you said something interesting, and I'm not sure if this is what you intended, but the difference between having a certain experience evoked by art versus that experience in real life. And if that's not what you intended, that's what I intend by my question.
That's what I meant.
So, for example, in the domain of music, which is where I work, there's this very interesting question. Why would you turn to music to evoke a certain emotion when our lives, our daily lives, are filled with these emotions? Is it the same, the real emotion, or the musically or artistically evoked emotion? Is that in a simulated emotion? Is it the same? The question arises in psychology. Why do people go to horror movies? Why do they want to watch barbaric images? Evolution has taught us to run away from such things, and yet we actually pay for them. Why do you listen to a sad piece if really the goal in life, presumably, is to become happier than you are? Why would you listen to an agitated piece of music or watch an agitating piece of art when clearly we spend a lot of time and money figuring out how to calm down? And all of these things lead to the question, why art? What is art? And what is its representational relationship to real life and the emotion and movement that's evoked by our real life experience? Anybody want to jump in?
Oh, I thought you were asking me.
Yeah.
I wonder whether actually, just to jump in, whether David has to some degree already answered some of that question when he showed the two arms, the photographed arm and Michelangelo's arm. I think what people are often searching for, this is a highly speculative, is two things. One is to engage with another individual's view of all those emotions, of the things that we experience around us. Leonardo da Vinci, an artist close to my heart, said that the great painter should be able to paint everything that is visible and invisible in the universe. And essentially, I think that what we're looking for when we go and look at works of art is greater understanding of those everythings, but broken down and helped along the way by a great artist. And so, if we, all of us, I think, in most of our daily lives, sitting on the crosstown bus, go through an enormous number of emotions at any one time. A lot of it is boredom and frustration, but there might be other things as well. When we stand in front of a work of art, it is with the aim of getting to grips with that emotion. David's point, I think, is also that we need to be grabbed in the first instance by that work of art in order for us to start that process of engagement. And I actually, of course, I completely agree with you about that. And so I think that at that point, the task of the artist, if you like, becomes understanding to some degree, whether consciously or subconsciously, and I was interested that you made that distinction earlier on, Matthew, that what it is that might grab that attention, what it is that is going to emotionally engage in order for the other kinds of process to begin. So I mean, I think that's how I would see it as an art historian and as a curator. I expect people to come to look at works of art at the Met as a way of looking at themselves, but in a way that is, in some senses, ordered and measured and to some degree mediated by that notion of somebody else.
Yeah. We've heard the word pleasure a lot. But if that's the case, then clearly viewing art is not necessarily something you do for pleasure. And you wouldn't have to derive pleasure in order to say that it's effective or good art.
This has opened so many different vistas.
That was the point.
One doesn't know where to begin. But I think one of the lessons we have learned from the frustratingly large question before us now, what is art? I have given up trying to figure out what is art. In the 15th century, and in Raphael's time, everybody knew what art was, and everybody knew that Raphael was really great. Now we look at Matthew's work,
and we say it's really great.
It is great.
Stop you right there.
So,
right? You're with me, right?
Here are several possibilities which are close to me. We can, Luke just said it, the one thing we can ask ourselves is, what is it that grabs our attention in Matthew's work? Where do we look first? Then, that's one thing we can ask, and we know a lot about the neuroscience of attention. The other thing, which is of course close to my own interests, is where does the body fit in? I see Matthew's work, I see these great complicated clusters of, is that me? From behind. I see these great complicated networks, and all I want to do is crawl through, or I have a sense of crawling through the big holes, or I see those beautiful buildings in the gaps. So, the bodily response to Matthew's work is really essential. But then the question of art and pleasure. It used to be thought that we love a beautifully depicted nude, male or female. We love colors and so on and so forth. But ever since Immanuel Kant came onto the scene, that abstruse German philosopher, we know that some of the questions relating to art, or some of the pleasures we derive from art, have to do with the pleasure in our judgments that we make about works of art. And that, I think, is something that both Ed and I have worked on at some length. It's not only what are the obvious pleasures like, or the obvious repulsions, or what are the pleasures or repulsions like horror, but what are the pleasures that we derive from deciding whether something is a work of art or not. I mean, that's at a much more complicated psychological level, but I think we're now getting closer to actually establishing what happens in the brain between those moments when you withdraw yourself from involvement in a work of art, you judge, and you derive some pleasure from saying, okay, in the end, I think Matthew is really great. So, yes.
Yeah, thanks. He came around.
Who else wants to jump in?
Well, I think the question also of what constitutes pleasure is a very sophisticated one. I mean, history is littered, art history, with artists who gave everyone exactly what they wanted. Like Alfred Munnings, the great, most expensive artist in the world in sort of 1898. I don't think the Met has one of his paintings up right now. Or Dolce, who painted these horrendously sort of sugary Madonnas that people just couldn't get enough of, And now we sort of hide them away in a box. Oh God, that awful chocolate box stuff. Our priorities as a culture very much inflect how we choose to approach that gesture. What is the gesture? What is the prominent gesture of a time? It's something that I think is really, and often it's a gesture of either implied sort of uber creativity, the expulsion of from the Garden of Eden, or the crucifixion, or all of the things you see up in the museum. A lot of these are not pleasurable experiences at all. They're actually extremely violent. They're, as someone remarked, this sort of Bible is like a Gothic horror. It's full of murder and blood, and yet it was the primary theme. Even the birth of Christ is like, it's the beginning of a terrifying story. So, and this is, now we sort of anthropomorphize and anthropologize those things into a kind of state of pleasurable contemplation. So there's a kind of historic distancing going on that I don't think is just Kantian, just the exercise of judgment. I think there's actually a kind of historical, a sense of the distance between us and historical states of violence that could be compared to a horror film. Where you're seeing something that's clearly, it's so distant that it becomes fictionalized, and then we can sort of contemplate it just like the lions, people watching a nature documentary. Oh, look at the cute lion eating the cute deer. We do that too, and we don't, but that's basically a horror film, especially if you're the deer.
Yeah, absolutely. Ed, did you want to?
Yeah, I think that this issue of what is it that gives you aesthetic distance from an emotion that might otherwise be threatening and not actually afford you the ability to sit back and observe it and take it in and get something from it is a big question, and it's not something we really know yet, but it's clearly an important one. And I think that this is one of those things that makes actually being attacked by a tiger versus seeing a movie of someone getting attacked by a tiger very different, which is that, and it relates to what I was saying earlier, that I think especially nowadays, as opposed to perhaps these previous time periods, we're much more understanding of the fact that people get aesthetic pleasure from very different things. Some people love horror movies, right? And while there is a sense in which we're getting that emulation, we're getting that imagery, and these types of experiences are activating emotional states that may not be positive. The net outcome of that, this kind of aesthetic appreciation or aesthetic experience, may be positively tagged even though the emotional systems that lead to them are not. And there's something about that really is related to the idea of aesthetic distance, that's not possible if it's happening in the moment, but there's something about this disengagement that allows a negative, intense emotional state to still give rise to an aesthetic appreciation that may be positively marked.
And I'd like to
I just wonder, sorry, I mean, we had a little talk about elephants, and I wonder if this might be the moment to bring an elephant onto the screen. Can we show the Sèvres vase? Whoops. Where did it go? Can we try that again? This is really unfair to this object. Even though it's a somewhat challenging object. I will tell you a little bit about it. When I first joined the Met, as I said, I was in the middle of an exhibition about Leonardo da Vinci. And the negotiations for my taking up the job of head of European sculpture and decorative arts were done on the telephone. I came over just before the Leonardo show opened. My brain was absolutely filled with Leonardo to the exclusion of almost everything else. And I stood in front of this pink vase and thought to myself, what the hell have I done? And because at that point, it was, and I think this comes to why I wanted to introduce this now, I think this comes to what you were saying. At that point, I had absolutely no notion of what to do with this object at all. It simply filled me with horror, really. And I don't know whether it was the pinkness or the goldness or the elephantness or whatever it was, or I suspect a lot of the associations, that kind of, thank God there was a revolution in France, side of things.
It has a vaguely sinister look to it as well,
yeah,
like the expression on its face.
They're pretty good, aren't they? Now I have to say, when we set about doing plain or fancy, I said to my co-curator, Eleanor Alcorn, in European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, the one object I want to put in this show, absolutely from the outset, is the pink Sèvres elephant vase. And I want to put it in because I've changed my mind about it completely, and this is what I actually was wanting to ask you about. I absolutely love this object now. I'm a passionate advocate for pink Sèvres, and this has taken me hugely by surprise, because I don't think I'd ever particularly looked at it before it was my job to do so. And now the whole range of emotions, it's a complete switch, in other words. I've moved from, I suppose, what might be described as disgust to real pleasure. And this object gives me genuine pleasure. I smile when I look at it. In the context of sort of Madame de Pompadour's France, which is the context to which this belongs, I think it performed as a kind of act of aristocratic escapism. I now find it that kind of escapist object, as escapist in its way, as Leonardo moving you from the world of the quotidian to an elevated spiritual world. It's very, and I suppose I came thinking, well, what is it that in terms of what's been set off in my brain, that switched, in that pink, for example, from giving me the heebie-jeebies to giving me, real pleasure? What's switched in terms of this assemblage of motifs, which to me, when I first looked at it, made absolutely no sense at all, and now I see as a brilliantly kind of balanced, beautifully designed object which moves from surface to sculptural form in a marvelously kind of fluid and imaginative way. And I'm baffled by my own response in all this, and so I was wondering if any of you can help me out. I can lie on, I can find a couch if you're if you're keen.
I think I don't think we really know what can lead to this kind of switch in artwork. By parallel, the people are studying these types of things and other types of visual stimuli, and I can give you just a short analogy, perhaps, which is that myself and others have studied what happens when you repeat a stimulus and a person becomes more familiar with it, and how does their just maybe basic preference for it change. And I think what we're starting to learn from that is that there's not one answer to that. Some things seem to bore you quickly. If I show you an image and I show it to you again, and then again, and then again, you would much prefer to look at something new. Other images actually show an opposite pattern. For example, faces are a category where if you show a specific face, people actually tend to start to show a familiarity preference. And my underlying sense is that as we learn more about this, we'll come to understand that it has something to do with, first of all, your set of tools for interpreting the object, and then the kind of level of complexity in that object, such that if something is uninterpretable for you, you can't make heads or tails of it, you're not going to get any pleasure from it. But maybe after enough exposure, you might start to be able to get your hooks into it a little bit. Like I've had this experience with actually a Pollock, where when I first looked at a particular Pollock, I found it kind of pretty and interesting, but after looking at it a lot, started to have certain eye movement patterns or certain things that I returned to, and each time I looked at it, could get deeper and deeper into it. So I was even perhaps developing my own language with this piece of artwork, where I was then getting more and more out of it. Eventually, I think that even with those types of artworks where we really get a lot into it, and like this is right now something you really get a lot of pleasure from, eventually your actual pleasure from it might drop off, even though and I think we often have the situation where we develop a different type of attachment to an object where we know that it brought us pleasure and we want to share that with other people, and maybe we got some information out of it and we want to share that with other people, even though we ourselves might not spend as much time looking at it anymore as we used to.
I suppose you had an urge to say something a little while back. You still have that urge?
The pink elephant really took me away from that. I mean, I think that this is, I believe it's called the availability heuristic, where you start to create a little feedback loop, it's self-gratifying, sort of self-pleasuring, like, aren't I wonderful for having figured out that I do like this thing that I hate, and then sort of groom yourself. I do it all the time. It's all I do all day. And it's sort of one of the artist's sole tools of survival is, because you make this thing, which is often quite horrible. And the real question sort of for artists is that you make something new. Like imagine the poor ceramicist. He probably had a drawing, and then he put it all together, and he probably had your reaction too. It was like, oh my God, this is horrible. We're going to be killed. They're actually going to execute us if we send this to the palace. And he had to show it to all this, and they're like, no, it's exactly what they ordered. And everyone wraps it up and it's like, they're not going to like this, not because. But for sort of contemporary artists, as these were, there's no horizon line of sort of somebody saying, it's going to be okay. There's just this sort of, the feedback loop has to be constructed. And the gesture that you're talking about is absolutely a key. There's nothing more satisfying than the application of gesture one-to-one. It is a very powerful feedback loop. But it's also incredibly deceptive, because if you've done it like literally tens of thousands of times, it's also nothing more depressing than when it's slightly off. It's like a tennis game that you can play weeks and weeks, and it's always slight. You always miss by just that much.
But do you think that one of the things that was baffling me was precisely what you were talking about before, that I didn't have a kind of empathetic handle. I didn't have that because it isn't straightforwardly figurative. I mean, this is as much for David as for you. I'm just wondering whether my bafflement was that I was very much at that moment in the world of figurative art, and that this object just felt alien in terms of both the combination of color and this sense of not having there not being an obvious, I suspect, gestural impulse that I had in relation to this object, because actually in that particular case the one thing I really didn't want to do was touch it.
Was there a kind of priming moment where you, like a key little tiny piece of information that unlocked the story of the object?
Yes, actually, you're quite right. What it was to understand that, finally to understand that the little square holes at the ends of the trunks were designed for candle holders, and that these objects would have had candle light playing across the surface. So in other words, that they had a kinetic quality, which I then had to reimagine as maybe as a kind of, and at that point I was finally able to connect with it as in the way that my almost instinctive ways had failed, had let me down on. This
I want to
be very
pose a
unhelpful.
final question and just have a very brief 30-second response from each of you. Some of what you've said bears on the question of what makes art enduring. Ed, you talked about, in some cases, people get bored very quickly. They've seen it once. Well, a lot of movies, people say, don't tell me about the movie because I won't like it. Well, enduring movies withstand hundreds of viewings, right? And presumably any kind of enduring art. It must be a real dilemma for an artist to make something because you might evoke a certain kind of response on first viewing that might be very different if they've had it in their living room for 25 years. What makes an artwork enduring? Is that relevant? And the study, the neuroscientific study, which looks at the immediate response and maybe a few additional exposures to that, what is the relationship between that and what makes art enduring? And Ed, you also used the word complexity. Is complexity essential to what makes it enduring so that each time you see it, you might find something new? I realize this is difficult in 30 seconds, but give it a shot.
That was 4 questions, One for each of us.
It's easy to ask questions. It's much harder to answer them, which is why
It's all good that way.
we can go a few minutes over, I believe, yes.
Well, I think so something I'd like to put back to the panel is the materials that you're working with this abstract manipulation of data, and your sort of historical expertise. Can you think of a historical moment where so much new information was arriving into a society that it was sort of impossible to be processed at that time? And if there was an artist who did that, what would that enduring artist look like, looking back in time at art? And for you, is there a way you sort of see this or understand this as the premise of a new kind of thinking about art? Because it is.
David, let's go to David.
Probably, that's too difficult. But I think that one of the things that I would like to say as we listen to all these big questions is that neuroscience cannot answer all the big questions. The question of why Ed likes that particular vase will always remain, I think, for a long time at least, remain inexplicable to me. What neuroscience can do is tell you about the mechanisms that underlie your reactions, but it can't necessarily give you the big answers. And in this way, I can say safely to my colleagues that the mystery of art will always remain.
Sure. I think this is obviously pure speculation, but when I think about what might make a work of art enduring, I return to this idea of information and getting something from it. Am I getting something from a particular piece of artwork? And perhaps those pieces of artwork that are enduring have enough kind of different things going on in them that the same person revisiting that piece of artwork can get something new from it each time or dig deeper into it, or different people who have very different cultural backgrounds can all also get something from it. And there may also be something that there are certain symbols or certain languages, and I also, I think that a lot of what artists are doing, oftentimes developing a language that is predating our linguistic ability to express it, that perhaps they are able to express something in a visual medium which is relying upon this huge machine in our head to do visual analysis, and are able to produce something that really is relevant and for many, many people and for a wider audience. So I guess in that way, I tend to use the word interpretability rather than complexity, because complexity has kind of a complicated history and kind of information theory. But if a certain concept or piece of art brings about many associations, perhaps that is one avenue I'm interested in investigating as what might be a great work of art.
Luke, a final word?
I think the answer to some extent lies in just how you've laid it out. What the tendency, I suspect, is that for neuroscience is to be able to analyze quite precisely the reactions to parts of a work of art. The gesture, the contrast of color, whatever it might be. And the more that a picture or an object has of that, the more possibilities it does to spark off things that are going on in your brain, the more likely it is that you're going to continue to return to it. So you use the example of Alfred Munnings, one of the great British artists from the late 19th century, early 20th century, the president of the Royal Academy, for those of you who don't know him, who railed against Picasso famously. Great big cart horses in fields. and an extraordinarily dull painter whose castigation of Picasso now seems like the most misguided moment in the history of 20th century art. Picasso, on the other hand, I think we would agree, not always, but often, provides us with that whole range of reactions that you've been describing, which can then develop into a whole range of thoughts, which then themselves become, to go back to your question, they become meditations on things, on essential experiences, on our experience of the world and our experience, our metaphysical lives as well. Munnings is not enduring, as his absence from the walls of the Met demonstrates. Picasso, as Leonard Lauder's most recent bountiful gift demonstrates, thank goodness is.
Well, thank you for coming this afternoon. I want to thank my guests today, Luke, Ed, David, and Matthew. I think this has been a most interesting discussion. If you would like additional information, if you would like to refer somebody to this panel or see it again to see if it endures the test of time, if there's enough complexity so that you might find new things each time, or to see if you were initially horrified, you might actually get some pleasure out of it later on, you can go online to worldsciencefestival.com. So thank you all very much.